All right.
Hmm.
So, getting into our stories, the first one comes from Security Dive, and the title here is Ransomware Gangs Shifting Tactics to Evade Enterprise Defenses. This one was very timely because we've talked about this a couple of times in recent episodes about how we're starting to see some shifts in tactics, and most likely we're going to see further shifts. And I think we speculated a little bit on what that would look like. And I would summarize this article as saying that the major shift that's underway right now is getting away from encrypting data as an attribute of a ransomware attack and focusing more on stealing your data and holding its disclosure for ransom. So basically pay us money or we're going to release your data into the wild. Which I find interesting because it doesn't, a lot of the harm. I suppose there is a benefit if a ransomware gang doesn't actually release it. There's a net benefit in terms of not reduced harm to the end victims,
Hmm.
because usually this involves personal data of customers. Sometimes it can involve trade secret data or whatnot, but the preponderance of these seem to address or to impact personal data, or at least the ones that we hear about. Maybe this happens a lot more frequently, and we only hear about the ones that involve personal data because those are the only ones that have reporting requirements. But
Yeah, that
but
could be.
the I guess my point is that if it does involve personal data, typically you're going to see the victim having to disclose and kind of bear a lot of the pain that comes along with the attack anyway. And so it leads me to wonder, like, what's the net benefit in actually paying the ransom
It's a good point.
in,
It's an interesting
in
point.
that
Yeah.
in that case? So
Yeah. The way I kind of read into this is it's interesting in that I might be able to have a little bit easier target environment if I'm only looking to exfiltrate data than I am looking to cripple an organization. So, for instance, typically in the olden days, 3 years ago, when ransomware got in, they would try to spread laterally, then encrypt a whole bunch of things at once and shut down a big operation. Well, what if I now just have access to just a couple of devices? Maybe I've started with a phishing attack against an executive. And so now really all I've got is maybe I can't go laterally very easily, but I've got access to that executive's data. Maybe there's some juicy stuff in there that they don't want disclosed. And maybe that's powerful enough to motivate them to pay. I don't know. It, and also the way that the article kind of talks about it is it appears that the defenses against encryption have gotten stronger, whereas the defenses against DLP exfiltration are still very weak for most companies.
yeah, absolutely. And they talk about how the 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 industry is really pivoting around easy detection or rapid detection and broad detection of malware once it's actually been identified. The industry reacts pretty rapidly, and the way this industry has evolved is such that if you're a ransomware as a service operator and your toolkit gets discovered, then suddenly you're not you don't really have a compelling service anymore for your customers who are actually the ransomware attackers. But what is not clear to me, by the way, is that this this new retread, or this new approach, is again much more focused on, I would call it living off the land, not really focused on leveraging malware. But I I guess what I'm struggling with is, how does that economy stick together? Like, I don't understand the function of the ransomware as a service operator if there isn't a malware toolkit involved. And so one of the questions I had as I'm reading this is this starting to cut out that quote service provider, and we're seeing attackers actually, launching these attacks on their own, or is there still some function? And I'm sure hopefully somebody in the audience here will give us an email or whatever and let us know. But I just wonder if is this also, you the harbinger of significant changes in the economics in the ransomware industry, as it were.
Could be. Could also be that this particular vendor writing this particular report is just trying to get some headlines.
That never happened, does it?
I hate to be cynical about it. The other thing that was interesting in this report that I found, though, is that tactics that were originally used primarily for large targets, large enterprises that were being victimized, are starting to go down market, which makes sense, right? I mean, once you've kind of broke ground with a tactic and a technique against a large enterprise, it becomes somewhat commoditized in these toolkits and starts going down market. So I can see that. So I don't know. The other thing they make a point of is that DLP is not often put in place at smaller organizations or mid-sized organizations, which is true. DLP is a pain in the butt to manage. So, and they sort of imply that DLP would catch some of this exfiltration work. I get that. It's probably true.
I
And I
say
think a lot
something
of, yeah,
controversial and say I've never seen a DLP deployment that wasn't just a checkbox.
yeah, anytime I've run into them, it's been very noisy. It takes a lot of staff, takes a lot of time. You're running down a lot of false positives, a lot of normal behavior. I think it depends on the data structure you're dealing with. If it's very structured data, like credit card information, that's easy, right? But otherwise, it's a lot of like behavior anomaly detection of yeah, I'm sure that there are DLP vendors that will light me up on LinkedIn saying, no, no, you need to look at mine AI enabled blockchain powered super duper DLP. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah, I think it very,
what I've always seen is the 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 only workable approach is using DLP tools as kind of a blunt instrument. So it's, you can or cannot write files to a USB drive. You can or cannot upload files to a webmail client. And it's those sorts of things that are, again, blunt instruments, rather than, again, like if you're a bank and you have a very standardized set of information, maybe that does make a big difference. But a lot of the companies, and I've been exposed to a lot of them. Uh, it's not been a workable thing because the kinds of data that they have to work with is just so varied, that you end up with, like you described it, a big noisy mess.
yeah, I think so. But hey, uh, I think for bigger organizations, they have a lot of compelling pressure to deploy DLP. And I think you're right. It does become a checkbox. I don't know how, I mean, it it's one of those where I think it has a lot of false negatives and a lot of false positives, and it's very noisy, and you need a lot of staff time to manage it well.
Well said. Well said. And by the way, I've in my career I've done many DLP deployments, and to a T, the vendors never really, like, clearly articulate exactly how resource intensive these are.
No, but they do a very good job of trying to make sure that you have very clear success criteria that aligns with their product before you start the POC.
That's certainly very true. Anyway, I'm not saying that they're worthless, um, but I would say you got to go into it with your eyes open if you are going to do a DLP deployment, because typically they're very dependent on being on the agent being on all of the points of presence, as it were, like your laptops or your gateways, whatever it is. And again, the only way that I've ever seen it work effectively is as a blood instrument. And I will tell you, not a lot of organizations have the intestinal fortitude, as they say, to actually stick with it because that's a pain in the rear end.
Yep, I would agree.